What is up, guys? I'm Inspector McDuck, and with the upcoming DLC coming out for Lies of P this summer, Lies of P Overture, we're probably going to get a lot more information about Gemini and the Legendary Stalker, but in light of that, I want to go over some evidence in the game that may already shed a lot of light on their stories. But while those are the main themes I'm going to explore here, I wanted to take a second to provide a larger look at all of the surrounding lore we'll be covering throughout, and I promise, all of it is important to go over so that we have a comprehensive understanding of the most important facts and evidence. So make sure you subscribe for more Lies of P videos, and let's get into it. So this video is meant to be a complete combination of my previous lore videos about the Legendary Stalker and Gemini, and while I won't get into the same level of detail here as I did in those, I'm still going to kind of cover the basics and expand on some of those ideas a little bit. So let's start with my theory about Gemini. It seems pretty obvious that Gemini wasn't always a cricket puppet inside of a lamp, and we know this through an ergo flashback on the Black Sea side, where Carlo is seen speaking to the Legendary Stalker, and he asks her to train him. Now we can assume that the Legendary Stalker wasn't telling her lamp to get rid of Carlo, right? So a lot of people initially thought that meant he was originally a human who died from petrification and then was turned into a puppet, right? But my theory is that he was never actually human. He existed in a puppet body all along, a stalker puppet. However, he wasn't just a stalker puppet or a normal puppet. He was the first puppet to be equipped with a P organ, which enabled him to store ergo and learn and adapt and grow. And he is the one who originally developed the cricket style that the Legendary Stalker is credited with before his ergo needed to be transferred into a cricket puppet in order to save his life. So, where does this theory come from? Well, let's go over some basic information. First, Gemini resides within Monad's lamp, which is described as a small lamp with a cricket guide puppet inside. So, this confirms that Gemini is actually a cricket puppet and not the lamp itself. Second, we gain some valuable information if we read the description for Gemini's iron protection and Gemini's emergency protection. Food for the cricket puppet that receives help from Gemini. The Gemini model was designed so it could be fed ergo to build affinity. However, no one could have imagined that this model had another ability that was even more special. This description has several huge implications. First, it seems to indicate that Gemini isn't just the cricket puppet. He's a model. He's the consciousness that lives within it, right? It says the cricket puppet that receives help from Gemini. Secondly, it refers to Gemini as the model that could be fed ergo to build affinity. And this would be crucial as a wholly autonomous puppet to ensure that Gemini continues to grow and becomes more human as he lives on. Third, the notion of building affinity, meaning building relationships, is a critical part of being human and would set Gemini apart from other puppets. So why would Geppetto and the workshop have a need for a puppet like this, right? Why would they need to make something that was so advanced? As far as we know, most puppets in the game are built and designed with a singular task in mind, right? They're service puppets, more or less. Whether they're butlers or maids, manual laborers, or entertainers. And these puppets seem limited in what they can do. They show very little to no signs of intelligence, which I take to mean that when they're first built, the ergo that they're powered by is their one and only power source. They're incapable of expanding or developing further unless their ego awakens, as we've seen with a few puppets in the game. The key thing to know moving forward is that I think Gemini was a very early model of puppet, and he was created in the earlier days of the workshop as a grand experiment. So let's consider what we know about the workshop and how the Alchemists came into play back then. The Alchemists are known as brilliant scientists, doctors, and engineers, but at their core they seem more like a cult. They seek truth based on their own culture and religious precepts, and they won't stop at anything to obtain new knowledge. Now, I call them a cult for a couple of reasons. First, it says that they have their own culture and religious precepts, but second, we know that despite them bringing prosperity to Krat, their arrival and their actions are entirely self-motivated. This is made very evident when we learn about the original leader of the Alchemists, Valentinus Monad. He was searching for a means to achieve immortality, right? He searched for the legend of eternal life with his colleagues for a long time. We also need to remember that it was the Alchemists who originally invited Geppetto to Krat after they discovered the potential of ergo. Both of these things are really important to keep in mind throughout this whole theory, because when talking about the Alchemists and their actions prior to Simon taking over, it's easy to think that they were mostly good guys, right? That they're doing things to help Krat prosper. But in reality, they're motivated very highly by their own desires. So even though the game more or less paints Valentinus as a decent guy, and, Krat erects a statue of him, I think the reality is that he wasn't so pure intentioned. He wanted to figure out how to become immortal, no matter the cost. So the Alchemists came to Krat with very clear intentions, right? They didn't show up just to start a local puppet business. They were searching for eternal life, and they thought that ergo was the key to it. So I think that Valentinus was encouraging Geppetto to push the limits of puppet technology and see how close he could get to making them human, so to speak, without revealing the Alchemists' true intentions. So because of this, Geppetto eventually made a major breakthrough and developed the P organ. And this was different than all of the puppet tech before it, which basically ran on the ergo that was initially implanted in it. The P organ was capable of storing ergo and using it to unlock new potentials for the puppet that it resided within. So to go along with the P organ, Geppetto also created a new intelligence model, a system that would actually collect the ergo and enable a puppet to learn and perform more actions than simply the tasks they were programmed with. This was the Gemini model, and combined with the P organ, it would create the first puppet that could essentially develop an ego. Remember, as far as we know, up until this point, all of the puppets were programmed to perform very specific tasks. But now Geppetto had made a puppet that could theoretically do anything. It could collect ergo and store it and use it to learn and adapt. It could behave like a human. And remember, this is corroborated by the description from Gemini's emergency protection and Gemini's iron protection. The Gemini model was designed so it could be fed ergo to build affinity. So this new puppet, with a P organ and the Gemini model running inside, showed tremendous potential for the Alchemists, right? They were set on finding a path towards eternal life. And at this point, they now had a proper vessel, so to speak. So all that was left to do was figure out how to take advantage of ergo to deliberately transfer someone's consciousness, someone's spirit, essentially, into a puppet body. So again, this new puppet, Gemini, showed a lot of promise for the Alchemists, but he also showed a lot of promise for the Stalkers as well. Considering the flashback sequence on the beach where the legendary Stalker is traveling with Gemini, I think she's speaking to him as her puppet stalker partner. But in order to explain the rest of that, we've got to dive into some history about the Legendary Stalker. Now, if you've seen my other video about the Legendary Stalker, then you'll be familiar with some of this already, but now let's talk about why I think the Legendary Stalker was Lady Isabelle Monad, and why she could have played a critical role in the story of Lies of P. There are 4 important facts to consider up front. the Legendary Stalker was known for enjoying La Bleuie, a vintage wine, as stated in this collectible called Have a Taste of La Bleuie, the greatest wine in the world. Even the Legendary Stalker enjoys La Bleuie. Taste the best wine chosen by the one who stood at the pinnacle. So, based on the wording here, we can assume that this wine was pretty expensive and only really enjoyed by Krat's upper class. Based on her uniform, the Legendary Stalker was originally a bastard and not a sweeper, which also ties her to Krat's upper class. In the flashback, we see that the Legendary Stalker visited the Monad Charity House, where students trained to be stalkers. This was also the home of the Monad family, including Sophia and Valentinus. So the Legendary Stalker had some degree of association with the Monad Charity House. And here's where it gets good, in the story trailer for the DLC, we can see her wearing a brooch that has the letter M on it, which very likely represents the name Monad. So this further strengthens her ties to the Monad Charity House and the Monad name. However, if we look closely, she also seems to be wearing an alchemist's cape with her uniform. And we know that the bastards were aligned with the alchemists, but why would the Legendary Stalker express such a direct connection to them? Now that we've gone over these details about the Legendary Stalker, let's now shift our focus to Lady Isabelle Monad. Who was she exactly? First, we know that she was a sponsor of the arts and had a street named after her, Rosa Isabelle Street. We know that she was a founder, or at least a key member of, the Rose Estate, which later became known as the Monad Charity House. So between these two things, we know that her name was associated with roses for some reason. We also know that she belonged to one of the old families of Krat, and she married Valentinus Monad, the leader of the Alchemists, in order to unite the old families with the Alchemists. Since she was married to Valentinus, and Sophia is the daughter of Valentinus, I think it's pretty safe to assume that Lady Isabelle was Sophia's mother. And finally, we learn from Sophia that her mother was also a listener, which she resented and kept a secret. Now, we don't have any information that explains exactly what her powers were, but I think we can assume that they're similar to Sophia's in that she can hear ergo and therefore talk to puppets. But the most important thing to focus on first is Lady Isabelle's marriage to Valentinus. Why her of all people? Well, to answer this, let's look at the bundle of old letters collectible we find in the Alchemist's Tower. In this, we can see that Valentinus originally partnered with the Volfe family to sponsor construction of a laboratory, and seems like it was being built directly in the Relic of Trismegistus, also known as the Devil's Pit. The family agreed to fund the operation, but wanted to keep it a secret, presumably so that they could accumulate even more wealth and establish themselves as the dominant family in Krat, right? They wouldn't have wanted any competition. And we can see that they even threatened Valentinus, indicating that they're a pretty powerful family and weren't intimidated by the alchemists. So this made me wonder why, right? What's in it for the Volfe family to get involved with the alchemists? Well, aside from it being a profitable business decision, I think the Volfe family wanted to maintain some degree of control over Krat, and they may have been worried that the alchemists would essentially take over, so this would give them some leverage. Remember, we know that Valentinus married Lady Isabelle in order to unite the alchemists with the old families of Krat. So this is where I think the biggest benefit for the Volfe family came into play. They arranged a marriage between a young woman in their family, Lady Isabelle, and Valentinus. I think Lady Isabelle could have originally been Lady Isabelle Volfe, and this marriage was arranged by the two groups for one very important reason. Not only were they very wealthy, but I think the Volfe family was also the head family of the bastards. And by marrying Lady Isabelle to Valentinus, it would create a mutually beneficial partnership between the bastards and the alchemists, giving the alchemists their own personal bodyguards, so to speak. So let's go over some evidence to back up this theory. What do we know about the Volfe family? We know that Red Fox is a member of the Volfe family through a few different sources, but most directly through Red Fox's amulet, which says, "The Volfe family's swordsmanship that is passed down through generations is famous for being sophisticated and refined." Alright, cool. So swordsmanship was not only important to the Volfe family, but they were actually renowned for it. We also know that they're respected for having high quality equipment. The Stalker with the fox mask was known to be the daughter of a time-honored family. It may have fallen into decline, but the old house's eye for exceptional equipment was as sharp as ever. So, the Volfe family seems to be highly respected fighters and at the top of Krat's upper class, and I think there's one more clue that points to their status as well. The description for the weapon etiquette states that it's a self-defense weapon adored by the leader of the bastards, and that social dignity can be seen not only in the ballroom, but also on the battlefield. So, since we've just established that the Volfe family was pretty renowned, if I had to guess, I would say that we can pretty safely assume that someone from the Volfe family was the leader of the bastards. So how does all of this tie into Lady Isabelle Monad potentially being the legendary stalker? Well, not only was Lady Isabelle a sponsor of the arts, but if she were also a member of the Volfe family, then it would make sense that she would be a good swordsman as well. So Valentinus married a woman who was not only a philanthropist and a member of Krat's most wealthy family, but he also married a woman who was trained to be a stalker. It was a win-win situation, basically. So we've laid a foundation that supports my theory that Lady Isabelle Volfe was a stalker who then married Valentinus Monad and became Lady Isabelle Monad. But why is this important? Well, now we need to look at a collectible called Fairy Tale of the Three Brothers of the Workshop Tower. Thus there lived a technician who made the friendly three puppet brothers, an alchemist who breathed life into puppets, and a stalker who rectified puppets gone wrong. The three brothers built the craftsman's workshop tower and made phenomenal puppets. Now, given what we know, I feel like it's safe to assume that Geppetto was the technician and Valentinus Monad was the alchemist. As for who the stalker was, it would have had to have been someone whom Geppetto and Valentinus trusted and considered a peer. So who would be a better fit than Valentinus' wife, Lady Isabelle, right? Now I do need to point out that this is referred to as a fairy tale and seemingly not an official record or anything. So we could consider this as more of the accepted truth by the public, right? Meaning, I don't think we have to take the word brother literally as referring to men and more so referring to a brotherhood, right? Like an association or a group of people. So Lady Isabelle Monad was very likely the stalker that helped form the workshop and was in charge of rectifying puppets gone wrong, which would be pretty easy for her since not only could she stop them physically as a stalker, but as a listener, she would have been able to hear the puppets ergo and potentially detect defects that way. So now let's go over one final set of clues that links all of this together. Remember Lady Isabelle's association with roses through Rosa Isabelle Street and the Rose Estate. Well, throughout the story trailer for the DLC, we see strong rose imagery associated with the legendary stalker, with these roses on the floor and this direct transition of a rose to the M brooch that she's wearing. There's a locket that Geppetto's puppet shows her that has roses engraved on it. And if we take a close look at her sword, we can see roses on the guard. On top of that, in the base game, Sophia has some association with roses too, with the door to her chambers in the Alchemist's tower being adorned with them. So, if they were family members and both of them had some associations with roses, then this checks out and establishes a connection between the legendary stalker and Sophia. Additionally, the legendary stalker's brooch with an M on it is similar to the brooch on this coat on the ground, which is also the same brooch found on the Someone's Memory costume. And we know this represents the Monad Charity House. So her custom brooch could mean that she's a sponsor of the charity house at the very least, or also represent her last name, which, if she's Lady Isabelle, would obviously be Monad. And remember how I pointed out the alchemist's cape attached to her uniform? A stalker with ties strong enough to the alchemists to fasten one of their capes to their uniform would make sense if she was a founder of the workshop and her husband was the leader of the Alchemists, Valentinus Monad. And a very specific final detail that I do need to address is that once the story trailer for the DLC dropped, all of the gaming outlets started referring to the Legendary Stalker by the name Leah, and this is a name we've never heard before. Now, I did touch on this in my DLC predictions video and addressed the fact that this woman could actually be Sophia's sister. We do get some very interesting text from a loading screen that indicates that Sophia had at least one other sibling, and I know a lot of people are speculating that the Legendary Stalker is just that. I do also need to point out that the Legendary Stalker and Sophia have nearly identical hairstyles, which would make sense if they were mother and daughter or even siblings. And while I do think it's definitely a possibility, I have to say that it's also not far-fetched to think that someone named Isabelle could go by a shortened version of their name, like L, or possibly even potentially Leah. And related to this, one more point I want to make about the Legendary Stalker is that we have no way of knowing if her true identity was secret or public. Now, I'm currently assuming that most stalkers kept their identities secret, because the ones that we know of at least all wear masks and have code names. And after all, if their identities were public, then the whole plotline about Alidoro being an imposter probably wouldn't exist. The only exception to this that I can think of is the White Lady blatantly telling us that her sister is Adelina Corday, but obviously we don't know if this is standard practice for a stalker or if her situation is unique. Anyway, what's also interesting to me is that no one refers to the Legendary Stalker by a code name. They just call her a Legendary Stalker. So I wonder what her moniker actually was. If she was known for the cricket style, did people call her the cricket? Or, as I was saying before, did she use a variation of her real name, Isabelle, but she went by Leah to keep her true identity a secret, right? We have no way of knowing, and I'm hoping that we'll find out answers in the DLC, but who knows. Okay, so now let's back way up to when I was originally talking about Gemini being the first puppet equipped with a P organ, and he was more or less designed to be as human as possible, and how that technology would not only benefit the Alchemists, who were seeking eternal life, but it would also benefit the Stalkers. What did I mean by that? Well, let's talk about the Stalkers and what we know about them. We're aware of two factions, the Bastards and the Sweepers, and each have their own style of fighting. The Bastards are the Stalkers who seem to fight with grace and elegance, their uniforms are neat and refined, and Path of the Bastard starting class is focused on the technique stat, which is the stat tied most prominently to the faster weapons in the game. The Sweepers, on the other hand, seem to be almost total opposites. These Stalkers are brutes. Their uniforms are created from patched together materials, and the Path of the Sweeper starting class focuses on motivity, which is the stat tied most prominently to the large, heavy weapons in the game. So what does this have to do with Gemini and how he could benefit the Stalkers? Well, if Lady Isabelle was the Stalker who helped found the workshop, then she would have been the Stalker most familiar with Gemini. She could have traveled with him and trained him to be her apprentice. And there are a few reasons to believe this that I cover in detail in my video about Gemini, but the most prominent connection we can make here comes from the technique amulet. There are innumerable Stalker skills and techniques, yet the puppet who equipped the amulet imprinted with every single combat method took them another leap forward. So it seems that a puppet came along at some point and, utilizing the technique amulet, revolutionized a new style of fighting, something that was separate from and more advanced than the Bastard and Sweeper styles. This was most likely the Cricket style, which is the third starting class in the game and balances both technique and motivity for a more comprehensive, balanced approach to fighting. We can assume that this was the technique of the Legendary Stalker, as she was known as neither a Bastard nor a Sweeper, but walked her own path to build up her many outstanding achievements. And if Lady Isabelle was the stalker of the workshop that traveled with Gemini, then she could have very easily learned the cricket style from him, especially if we remember the fact that Sophia tells us that Lady Isabelle was also a listener who could speak to puppets, right? So, after learning the cricket style from Gemini, Lady Isabelle became known as a legendary stalker, and she and Gemini were partners. And this is the state they were in during the flashback on the Black Sea side, where Carlo asks her to train him. Now, before we move on, I need to divert for a bit and go over the details of an event that seem relatively simple to understand on the surface, but actually play a critical role in this whole story related to the legendary stalker, Gemini, Carlo, and Geppetto's puppet. And that's Geppetto's relationship with a woman named Camille. Camille was, according to the Saintess of Mercy statue gallery key, a genius engineer and whom created the original Saintess of Mercy statue, which we know can be used to give a puppet a new life. Camille seems to have been Geppetto's wife, as backed up by a statue mentioning her in front of the Estella Opera House. It's dedicated to her by Gigi, which seems pretty obviously referring to Giuseppe Geppetto. So, we know that Camille was important to Geppetto, and that she died. And she seemingly died from the petrification disease because we later find out some very sad information about her. It was God's miracle that Camille was made into a made puppet. Despite being in the early phase when the design was rudimentary, Camille caught and saved a baby who fell from a crib. Such function was nowhere to be found in the design. Her appearance and identity in living years were similar, so it was probably easier for her to manifest an ego. After hurriedly collecting Camille to launch an investigation, the Order found out that she understands language and got a message: "Send me back to my child." This event would have shaken the workshop and the alchemists to their core. It was the first sign of proof that a person who died from petrification could essentially be resurrected by using their ergo. It was crude, of course, but it worked, and both parties would have been elated. The Alchemists and Valentinus, because of the promising nature of the discovery, taking them one step closer to immortality, and Geppetto, who had basically revived his deceased wife. Now, I'm assuming this event was an intentional experiment on Geppetto's part, because it says that the doll was made in Camille's image, essentially. That leads me to believe that once Camille died from petrification, Geppetto deliberately collected and used her ergo in a puppet that he had designed to resemble his late wife. We can also assume that at this point in time, Geppetto was still building and testing Camille, as it says she was still in the early phase of development, so she hadn't been sold or delivered to another family, which means that when she caught and saved a baby who fell from a crib, it probably would have been a baby close to Geppetto, which is Carlo, of course. Camille was Carlo's mother, who died from petrification sometime after he was born, and then was resurrected as a puppet. So after Camille was discovered to be the first puppet to awaken and remember parts of her past life, the alchemists, of course, wanted to know what made her different from all the puppets before her. So, sadly, they interrogated her and ultimately took her apart. And this very likely would have devastated Geppetto. And if Lady Isabelle Monad was indeed the stalker who helped co-found the workshop with him and Valentinus, then she would have seen exactly what Geppetto had gone through. The loss of his wife, his act of mourning, and his act of deliberately creating a new puppet using her ergo in an attempt to bring her back to life. Now, as I always say, it's almost impossible to nail down the exact timing of certain events. But I think here we can make a few pretty reasonable assumptions based on everything we've just covered. First, this incident with Camille seems to have happened in the early history of the workshop. If we go back to the collectible, it mentions that later means of control such as the Grand Covenant emerged. So that means all of this with Camille was sometime before the establishment of the Grand Covenant, and we know that didn't happen until Vanini came of age and started working with Geppetto. Second, based on everything I covered earlier about Gemini and the development of the P organ, I think the incident with Camille is what led the Alchemists to encourage Geppetto to push the boundaries of puppet technology, right? They now had evidence that a person could die from petrification and reawaken as a puppet. So they put Geppetto to task in figuring out how to replicate this series of events. So that could possibly mean that the events with Camille are what led Geppetto to create the P organ and the Gemini model. And finally, we have pretty good evidence and reason to believe that sometime after the events of Camille is when Geppetto enrolled Carlo at the Monad Charity House. Remember, the story of the Camille puppet involves her catching a baby who fell from a crib, who was almost certainly Carlo. And after Camille was disassembled and the Alchemists were pushing Geppetto harder and harder to make advancements in puppet technology, it meant that Geppetto threw himself into his work, as a lot of people would do in a state of grief, and it led to him not being able to care for his son. All of this is very important to keep in mind as we move forward into new territory, where I'll make some connections between the Legendary Stalker, Gemini, Carlo, and ultimately Geppetto's puppet. So with those backstories out of the way, let's move forward and talk about some significant things that I think happened both to Gemini and the Legendary Stalker prior to the events of the game, and how this ultimately led to us, Geppetto's puppet, waking up on a train. Now, I do of course have to say that some or all of this may be confirmed or disputed based on what happens in the upcoming DLC, but for now, this is how I'm choosing to interpret the information that we currently have in the base game. So to move forward, we have to continue assuming that the Legendary Stalker is Lady Isabelle Monad, and that she was acquainted with Geppetto. And I say this not only because of her status as a potential co-founder of the workshop, but also because of her obvious ties to the Rose Estate, aka the Monad Charity House, and the fact that students there could train to become alchemists, stalkers, and workshop technicians. Prior to the internal revolt amongst the alchemists, and Simon Manus taking over as the new leader, those three factions would have worked very closely together as the backbone of Krat, right? The alchemists, the workshop, and the stalkers all working in tandem. But as we know, those alliances were later broken, and I think the Rose Estate incident was the catalyst for that. We have very strong reasoning to believe that the Rose Estate incident was a deliberate attack by the alchemists and Simon specifically, right? We know that it resulted in a large-scale spread of the petrification disease, which gave Simon plenty of people to experiment on. We know that it led to Valentinus' apparent death, which I personally question, and you can watch my video about the Hermit if you want to learn more about that theory. And it also led to Sophia's disappearance. And we eventually learned that means that she was locked in the Alchemist's tower and experimented on by Simon. Now, with Valentinus gone and Simon Manus taking over as the new leader of the Alchemists, there was a divide amongst these factions of alchemists, the workshop, and the stalkers. Those who chose to side with Simon and continue working with the alchemists, and those who decided to form a rebellion, basically. And we can see some evidence of this through various collectibles we find in the game, and piece together at least some idea of how this all played out. By reading the Vanini guides, we learn about Medoro, the reporter, and in Special Report Foreigner's Confession, Medoro writes about an alchemist from the Far East who learned of the group's secrets and quit. And if we complete Eugeni's questline, whom we know is also from the Far East, we learn towards the end of the game that the original Alidoro was her brother, but he had to keep it a secret in order to keep her safe. I'm being chased because I know the biggest secret of Krat. Instead of revealing myself and risking your life, I'll choose to vanish forever. So, based on this, we can assume that Medoro and Alidoro were part of this faction that split off from the Alchemists. We also know that Alidoro went one step further and destroyed the original Sanctus statue, as he wrote in the frayed notebook. I do not regret destroying the Sanctus statue. I had to stop it from being used for humans. I came from across the wide ocean. And you'll notice that the notebook itself features his insignia. If we look at someone's report notes notebook, which was also written by Medoro, it says this: Lumacchio is ill. Sophia is missing. Lorenzini lost hope. H is dead. And here I am, Medoro. We risked our lives and fought from each post, but sometimes there are no rewards. Now, while we don't have confirmation who Lumacchio and H are meant to represent here, and that's a topic for another video, we do know who Sophia and Lorenzini are. So this shows that, at the very least, Medoro, Sophia, and Vanini were all on the side that opposed the Alchemists. There's also a line on the next page talking about unearthing the truth and unveiling the lie. And looking back at Special Report Foreigner's Confession, Medoro writes about the dangerous things the Alchemists are doing in Krat and how he intends to communicate this information to the public. But at the end of it, there's a note saying that this publication was banned for spreading false information and that Medoro has been suspended from the newspaper. So, how is this related to the Legendary Stalker and her fate? Well, based on everything we just talked about, it's clear that the Alchemists were hiding the truth and attempting to silence anyone who knew it. They were dangerous, and going back to the incident at the Rose Estate, there are a few more key assumptions to keep in mind. First, it seems that all of the memories on the beach reflect Carlo's times at the Monad Charity House. So this means that when we see the Legendary Stalker apparently mourning someone's death, we can assume that this is related to the Rose Estate incident. Second, we know that Carlo lived at the Monad Charity House, and as described in a loading screen, we know that he died of petrification. So, putting these things together, the most common assumption here is that the Legendary Stalker is mourning the death of Carlo after the events of the Monad Charity House. Now, we could find out that this isn't the case once we get the DLC, and maybe she's mourning someone other than Carlo, but getting that specific detail wrong doesn't derail my theory. But still, putting all of this information together, we can again lay out the effects of the Rose Estate incident. Simon Manus became the new leader of the Alchemists. Valentinus Monad was now dead or missing, and if the Legendary Stalker was Isabelle Monad, then Valentinus was her husband. Sophia Monad went missing, and again, if the Legendary Stalker was Isabelle Monad, then Sophia was her daughter. And finally, Geppetto's son Carlo died from petrification. Because of this incident, it would make total sense for the Legendary Stalker and Geppetto to break off from the Alchemists and side with the rebellion. Especially because if my theory about the Legendary Stalker being one of the co-founders of the workshop is correct, then she would have been business partners with Geppetto at the very least, and possibly even friends with him. And if that's the case, then it would make total sense for her to be mourning Carlo's death, because she would have known that Carlo was Geppetto's son. This is all very important to keep in mind because the Legendary Stalker and Geppetto would have both wanted revenge against Simon, so they would have a common enemy. Now, how all of that played out exactly, we don't know. It looks like we'll learn a lot more from the DLC, but for now, at this point, the only thing we really know for sure is that after the events at the Rose Estate, Geppetto started planning the puppet frenzy. And he eventually created Romeo, the king of puppets, as well as the puppet that we play as in the game in order to bring Carlo back to life. We also know that at some point, somehow, Gemini was transferred from his previous form, which I think was a puppet stalker who created the cricket style, into his new form, which is the cricket puppet inside Monad's lamp. So, now it's time to build a theory. And again, I'm assuming at least some of this will be addressed in the DLC, but for now, let's move forward with what we know. After the Rose Estate incident, I think the Legendary Stalker went into hiding. And we get some glimpses of this in the newest DLC trailer, but even before we got that trailer, I assumed that she more or less disappeared for a while and then resurfaced just prior to the events of the game. And this assumption is based almost entirely on the situation we encounter at the very start of the game. When we first wake up at the start of the game, Sophia makes two very significant comments. First, she says this.
Ah, there you are. I've been looking all over for you.
And immediately following that, when we find the lamp containing Gemini in what appears to be a pool of blood, she says this.
I see they got Gemini too.
Now, I draw two conclusions from this. First, Sophia somehow had pre-existing knowledge of us and has been trying to find us for some time now, right? The second spoken line of dialogue in the game is her calling out to Geppetto's puppet specifically, not blindly reaching out to anyone who can hear her. She was seeking us out. She even says later at the hotel that she searched all over the city of Krat to find us. But if Sophia was trapped in a tower, then how would she have even known about us? And we'll get to that in a minute. Second, Sophia says they got Gemini too, which means that they, whoever they are, got someone else aside from Gemini. So, who is she talking about? And again, how would she possibly know this if she's trapped in a tower? Let's look again at this situation on the train. In the car where we wake up, there are splatters next to some furniture that's been knocked over. And as we enter the next car, there are bottles on the floor and a massive puddle of blood next to a table. And this is where Gemini is sitting. And finally, as we enter the third car, there's another splatter of blood and then some larger splatters that lead to the door. Now, based on Gemini's presence alone, it makes perfect sense that the legendary Stalker was in the train car, right? We've established that he's heavily associated with her at this point, and we'll soon talk about how he ended up in the lamp. But for now, let's assume that the most likely candidate for the person who would have brought Gemini onto the train would be her. But what happened in there? Well, the details of my theory could go one of two ways, but it starts with this. The legendary Stalker somehow knew of our existence, Geppetto's puppet, and knew that we were on the train that held Geppetto's hidden workshop. Like I said, she and Geppetto probably would still have been allies at this point, because after the events of the Rose Estate, they were both working against the Alchemists. Plus, obviously, the legendary Stalker wouldn't have known that Geppetto plotted and executed the puppet frenzy, so she still would have trusted him at this point. So my first theory is this. After the workshop tower collapse, most of the Stalkers in Krat were dead, and the legendary Stalker would have needed some help, some backup. She knew that Geppetto was building us and came to the train to activate us, to help her fight, and somehow she relayed her plan to Sophia. I personally think she did this through Gemini because if they were both listeners, then they could communicate with each other by relaying messages through Gemini. This is the only logical explanation I can think of to explain how Sophia knew of our existence despite being locked in the Alchemist's tower ever since the events of the Rose Estate. But if you guys have a different theory, please let me know in a comment down below. Anyway, the legendary Stalker came to the train to activate us, but she was followed by the Alchemists, or at least someone who worked for the Alchemists. She entered the train, made it all the way to the back car where we were sitting, and they ambushed her. She was overpowered and outmatched and severely injured, causing her to drop her lamp on the ground, which damaged Gemini in the process. Then she was abducted by the Alchemists, and since Lady Isabelle was a Stalker and a listener, she would have been more valuable to Simon alive rather than dead. Her being a listener is also a key point for the next segment, but we'll get there in just a minute. Before we move on, there are a few quick things that I have to point out that may end up contradicting or disproving this theory in the future, especially depending on if we get more information from the DLC or another source. First, two of these splatters are obviously red, blood. But the other splatters are darker and they don't look the same. And initially I thought that they were related to the Gemini situation, but if we look back in the secret workshop, we see the same splatters in there as well. So I think they're meant to be something else that were already there before. I just have no idea what? Second, there's also this giant black puddle on the table that is clearly not blood. Is it oil? Is it ink? I have no idea. When you defeat puppets in the game, you get covered in this brownish liquid. When you defeat carcass monsters, it's this blue-green color. Neither of them are black. So where is this black liquid in the train coming from? I have no clue. And finally, when we return to the train car in the last third of the game, the blood stain by the door is still there, but the massive blood puddle and the black liquid are gone, which is weird, right? Like, did someone come clean it up? You know, I don't know if this is deliberate on the developer's part as a clue, or if it was simply a mistake. I do know that this is actually a totally separate map in the game that exists as a copy of the first level. So maybe when they were copying assets over, they overlooked the blood puddle and black liquid. Who knows? But that's why I said my theory could go one of two ways, because of this black liquid. I do think it's also possible that instead of the Legendary Stalker coming to the train to activate us, she may have already been in the car with us, guarding us, or waiting for Geppetto, and was ambushed. And maybe the black puddle on the table could be from an inkwell that was knocked over if she was sitting there, you know, writing a document or something. Otherwise, I don't currently have any guesses as to what this black liquid could be, but if you guys have any theories, I would love to hear them. Either way though, it's obvious that there was some kind of struggle because of the furniture that's knocked over and the puddles of blood. So even though I can't explain the black spot or why it appears to be cleaned up later, I still think that what happened was the Legendary Stalker was on the train and was ambushed and abducted by the Alchemists. And now with Gemini being damaged, Sophia would have been aware that he had gone offline and could therefore assume that her mother had been captured or killed. So she sent out her butterflies to try to locate us, not knowing exactly where we were, hence her saying, "I've been looking all over for you." And when she says, "I see they got Gemini too," I think that's because she could have assumed that when he went offline, that meant they had captured her mother. And that makes it all the more interesting later when Sophia tells us that she woke us up because we're the only ones that can stop Simon. It makes total sense. The Legendary Stalker was Krat's last hope, and now she's gone. It's up to us. But it doesn't end there, and I said we'd talk about the fate of the Legendary Stalker, and there's a big reason why I keep saying I think she was abducted and not killed. Remember, like I said, if the Legendary Stalker was Lady Isabelle Monad, that meant she was also a listener. And that leads to my next theory. If the Alchemists abducted the Legendary Stalker, what did they do with her? Well, it's very sad to say, but this. I think the Walker of Illusions is Lady Isabelle Monad, the Legendary Stalker, and I've got tons of evidence to back this up. First, we obviously know that the Alchemists were experimenting with humans and ergo. We meet test subject 826 in the Alchemist's tower, who says he's sick of consuming ergo and that he was made for reading memories of ergo. And it's interesting that he's number 826 because that's a big number, right? That shows that the Alchemists have gone through tons of human test subjects trying to create superhumans, essentially, right? But that's potentially only counting the test subjects that they're actually keeping track of. We also see various levels of humans who have been experimented on by the Alchemists and have been altered or affected by ergo in other ways, whether it's Krat's citizens who were becoming petrified and then turned into carcass monsters, or crazed violent test subjects who seem to have lost their minds, or the Alchemist soldiers of varying shapes and sizes who seem mentally stable for the most part and have heightened abilities. Either way, all of these people represent deliberate actions by the Alchemists in order to find a solution to evolving beyond normal human limits. Second, when we're in the barren swamp, we enter a hut and find this artifact, Experiment Report of Order, Test Subject 890. In it, it mentions the most successful case from the elixir injection experiments. On the next page, we learn that 3 patients died from the injections, but one of them, number 890, survived, although they're experiencing dissociative amnesia, seizures, aggressive urges, and hallucinations. And on the third page, we learn that this test subject was a stalker with verified physical abilities. We also see that Sister Adriana is meant to be the next experiment, and we learn later through the Sad Zealot's ergo that she is who becomes Luxatia. Then we go down the ladder where we meet and defeat the Owl Doctor and read the description of his mask. It is the mask of one who had a name up until his final moments, but was forgotten in the end. The alchemist's merciless experiments pushed him to his limit. In his pain, he denied reality and escaped into delusion. So for a moment, you might think that the Owl Doctor is the stalker they're referring to in the document, since it said the patient had amnesia and experienced aggressive urges. But then, in the corner of the same room, we find this note. I am not number 890. Name, precious, forgotten. So, the test subject stalker in the note is not the Owl Doctor, it's someone else. And this is one of those things, just like with the Hermit, where the information seems deliberate. The devs want you to think about this. They want us to figure out the mystery. The Alchemists didn't just take some random stalker. They're talking about the Legendary Stalker. Third, and I think this goes without saying, but this boss usually gives people a lot of trouble. I mean, she's hard, right? She's quick, and she has exceptional fighting prowess. It's pretty obvious that she was probably a stalker in her former life, and her movements and difficulty are worthy of someone considered a legendary stalker. She's clearly a step above the members of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, as well as Red Fox and Black Cat. She's also the only human opponent that we fight who is dual-wielding weapons, one large blade and one smaller one, which also seems to set her apart as having a unique fighting style. I think she's using the cricket style here. Now, I do have to point out that Luxatia uses a sword and a shield in her second phase, but in my opinion, that wouldn't require near the amount of training or discipline needed in order to wield 2 weapons. And finally, it's subtle, but we get this moment from Sophia earlier in the game, when we meet her projection at the Saintus statue.
The power to hear ergo is getting stronger. It's powerful enough to send not only my voice, but even illusions.
As a listener, Sophia can send projections, illusions. The Walker of Illusions is the name of the boss. And if it wasn't obvious enough, she can do this. She can project an illusion of herself, just like Sophia. Now, I don't think Isabelle could do this before, but now she's been experimented on and fed ergo. And just like Sophia, her powers have increased. And she also seems to have lost her mind and is experiencing aggressive urges and hallucinations, just like the report mentioned. So, the alchemists ambushed Lady Isabelle on the train and brought her to the collapsed workshop, which is now a base of sorts for them. And they found some success in her, but ultimately, she didn't meet their needs. And that's why the report mentions that a sample extracted from her will be used to develop the elixir for Sister Adriana. And that's also why there's a note hinting at Luxatia in the next room. Now, why is the Legendary Stalker, the Walker of Illusions, here in the workshop tower? I don't know. She's really not guarding anything significant, and her drops are pretty basic, so my only guess is that Simon could have suspected that we'd come to the workshop looking for him, so he stationed her there as a guard to block our path, and there are several armed alchemists on the other levels, so there may be some significance to it that I'm missing, unless it's just something that the developers thought would be cool to include. I really have no idea. Anyway, yeah, the Legendary Stalker, Lady Isabelle Monad, has a very sad ending, but we've got to keep going because there's one more mystery that I want to solve, and that's what happened to Gemini before we met him. even more so than my theory with the Legendary Stalker, where a lot of it was based on her being Lady Isabelle Monad. The vast majority of my theory about what happened with Gemini relies heavily on the fact that I think he was originally a Stalker puppet equipped with a P organ who invented the cricket style. And I've gone all over that a couple times in my video about Gemini and earlier in this video, and I've already laid all of that out. However, I will say that if you're familiar with this theory and you're still not convinced, then maybe what I'm about to say will change your mind. The key thing to remember moving forward is that I think Gemini was a very early model of puppet. He was an early grand experiment by Geppetto and the workshop to create a puppet that was as close to human as possible. So, the workshop developed this Stalker puppet who became an expert fighter and developed the cricket style, and then eventually taught that style to the woman who would eventually become known as the Legendary Stalker. So that begs the question, if Gemini was an advanced Stalker puppet with amazing fighting skills, what happened to him? How did he end up inside the cricket puppet in Monad's lamp? Well, that's currently still a mystery, and I have a very strong feeling we'll learn the answers in the upcoming DLC, but ahead of us potentially getting those answers for sure, I wanted to throw my personal theory out there. We have this shot in the story trailer for the DLC of the Legendary Stalker fighting someone, and people are already theorizing that it's Gemini, and I'm inclined to agree. First, his chest plates do seem to resemble the sections of a cricket's body, which I think is not necessarily just a coincidence. Second, just like the Walker of Illusions, he's dual wielding a large weapon along with a small one, and I'm personally interpreting this to mean that he's using the cricket style, which is basically a balance of strength and dexterity, or motivity and technique in the world of Lies of P. However, as I've said a few times before, I think most people disagree with my theory that Gemini was originally a puppet. But I think that's a very important factor to consider here, because if this is Gemini, what are his motivations? If he was partners with the Legendary Stalker, why would he be fighting against her here, but then team up with her again later once he's inside the lamp? Why is he one of the good guys when we meet him if he turned against her in the past? In an attempt to answer this, let's consider this very interesting line of dialogue we get from Gemini when we enter the Relic of Trismegistus for the first time.
Wait, is this the Relic of Trismegistus? You know, it's the strangest feeling. I think I've been here before.
Now, Gemini doesn't really say anything else like this in the entire game. He introduces us to several locations when we enter them and provides us with information about them, right? But this is the only place that he remarks as feeling like he's been there, but can't quite remember for sure. Why is this important? Well, remember that the Gemini model was designed to be fed ergo, which would mean that he could and would regularly be storing potentially massive amounts of it. And the Relic of Trismegistus is the main source of ergo in all of Krat. Plus, think about how Gemini reacts when we encounter a dimensional butterfly. He says, why is the ergo reacting like that? So this isn't something tied to him inherently. It's something related to a surge in ergo. And in the Relic of Trismegistus, there's a high concentration of dimensional butterflies in this same area. So my personal theory as to why Gemini's memory of visiting here is foggy is because of the enormous concentration of ergo in the area. And the last time he was here, his P organ became overloaded with ergo and became corrupted. And, dare I say it, but it maybe even sent him into a frenzy. Now you might be thinking that this doesn't make any sense, because when we visit here, we've got a P organ, but we don't become overloaded and go crazy, right? Well, I think the main difference here lies in the Gemini model. In my original video about Gemini, I said that I wasn't sure what the description meant when it said that this model had another ability that was even more special. But now I think that's referring to its ability to actually collect and transfer ergo as needed. Think about it. When we kill an enemy, Gemini is the one that collects the ergo and stores it for us. We then have to use Sophia, or the power of a stargazer, to transfer that ergo from Gemini into ourselves. We've got a P organ, and we can make choices in the game to enhance our abilities, but we're only capable of storing ergo in it, not actually absorbing it. On the flip side, the Gemini model inside the cricket puppet still has the ability to detect and absorb ergo. The difference here is that the cricket doesn't have a P organ, which I think means there's no way for his systems to become overloaded or corrupted like they were before. Anyway, I think in the past, Gemini visited the relic of Trismegistus for whatever reason and lost control. Too much ergo overloaded him and consumed him, and he went into a frenzy. And I think the Legendary Stalker had to rise up against him to put him down. That's why he's fighting against her. He's no longer in control of himself. And that's why the Blue Guardianship Amulet exists. The girl from the Monad family felt the puppet's pain, and it made her sad. She made a special amulet to help the dying puppet recover. Now this is obviously referring to Sophia visually and descriptively, and from what we know, both from things that happened in the past and things that we witness in the present day of Krat, the most likely candidate for a puppet whose death would make Sophia sad is Gemini. Aside from us, of course, but I don't think that she made the amulet for us. Because after the Legendary Stalker stopped him and damaged him beyond repair, Sophia felt bad for him and transferred his remaining consciousness, the Gemini model, into the cricket puppet within Monad's lamp. Thus, Gemini, the cricket puppet, was born. Okay, great story, right? And like I always say, where's the evidence? Well, I like to base my theories on as much in-game information as possible. And I have a feeling a lot of you aren't going to like where this is about to go. Based on everything we know about Gemini, about his abilities, about learning and growing and developing a new fighting style, I theorized that he had a P organ. After all, that's how we, as Geppetto's puppet, improve our abilities and grow. But do you know who else had a P organ? It's sad to say because the Legendary Stalker didn't get a happy ending either, but I think the Nameless Puppet was made from Gemini's original body. The Nameless Puppet was the first puppet made by the old man that was mounted with a P organ. Its ergo efficiency was not just unremarkable, it was destructive. Thus, the Nameless Puppet was not chosen for the boy's body and sealed away. Now there is so much to unpack here. If the Nameless Puppet was made from Gemini's original body, then this makes sense and aligns with my theory on how Gemini became corrupted. It directly says that he was not efficient with his ergo usage. And as a side note, this also supports my theory on why Sophia remarks that the real Gemini isn't so calm. If he was filling himself with ergo and began having difficulty containing or controlling it, it could have made him behave a little irrationally or hot-headed. And just like the Walker of Illusions, the Nameless Puppet is an exceptional fighter, right? He's quick and can use his weapon in multiple ways, so it seems pretty obvious to me that his fighting style is on another level, far beyond what we see with any of the other Stalker-type enemies in the game. And that's because both the Walker of Illusions and the Nameless Puppet are using the cricket style. Now, let's go back to the shot from the DLC trailer. He's using two weapons, so like I said before, this is probably the cricket style. And this person is tall and strong, and if we look at the shape of their body, they're almost impossibly skinny for someone with enough strength to swing a greatsword with one hand. His pants don't even fit around his waist. That looks like a puppet body to me, friends. It's also apparent that the Nameless Puppet, or at least parts of him, have been around for a while. Let's take a look at the King of Puppets' body, for instance, especially his legs, and take note of all the different joints and pieces of articulation. He even seems to have joints for his toes, right? All of these things would lead to him being more nimble for fighting. Now, compare that to the Nameless Puppet, and his legs look old. They look wooden. They look antiquated. They look like technology from the very early days of the workshop, back when Gemini would have originally been built. And I looked at almost all of the other puppet models in the game, and the Nameless Puppet's legs, as far as I can tell, are unique. They are distinctly old tech. Now remember how we talked about the story of Camille, and how I think that incident of showing that someone's ergo could be used to essentially revive them as a puppet was a revolutionary discovery, right? And that also potentially led to Geppetto creating the P organ and the Gemini model in an attempt to make a puppet as close to human as possible. Well, when Carlo died from petrification, Geppetto used his knowledge and experiences from Camille and Gemini and combined them to create the most advanced puppet yet. A puppet with a P organ, like Gemini, that was also deliberately powered by the ergo of the person that he wanted to bring back to life. However, I personally think he didn't implant us with the Gemini model because that could have potentially overwritten Carlo's memories. But it makes perfect sense to me. Once Carlo died, Geppetto first tried repurposing Gemini's original body as a proper vessel for his son, right? It says the nameless puppet was not chosen for the boy's body. That, to me, sounds like Geppetto had at least planned on using Gemini's body first before building us. Geppetto designed us as a stalker with a P organ, powered by Carlo's ergo, that was also capable of storing ergo to learn and grow, so that ultimately Geppetto could use that power to resurrect Carlo. And as a quick side note, have you ever wondered why Sophia is the one that wakes us up on the train and not Geppetto? I think it's because Geppetto's original attempt at creating a vessel to revive his son was unsuccessful, right? We just talked about how the nameless puppet's ergo efficiency was destructive, and Geppetto was worried that if he activated us too soon, we'd be unstable and, I assume, potentially even rebel against him. If we look at the last resort item, it says just that. The old man feared the possibility of his son failing to awaken properly and going into a frenzy. This initialization device was made as a necessary evil for delicate readjustments. And looking at the Piercing Hatred amulet, which we get by exchanging the nameless puppet's ergo, it says multiple cores holding concentrated ergo were used to boost its firepower. So to me, this says that Geppetto's first solution for collecting enough ergo to revive Carlo was to directly implant it across several cores. We also see this exact same scenario when we fight Romeo, and he tells us that he's burning up inside because he's got too much ergo inside and he's becoming unstable. His ergo is even referred to as the Burnt White King's ergo. This is all so fascinating to me because it explains how Geppetto experimented with different designs before landing on ours. And going back to Sophia waking us up and not Geppetto, let's consider why Geppetto was trapped in a carriage on Elysian Boulevard. What was he doing there in the first place? Well, as soon as we rescue him, he says a couple of very peculiar things.
It's a dream come true. Seeing you like this. I need to take care of the puppets at City Hall. Won't you help me, son?
First, I think he says it's a dream come true seeing us like this because we're stable and obedient. We're not in a frenzy like he feared. Second, he sends us directly to City Hall to take care of the puppets that are there. And once we do that, what do we find? The scrapped watchman drops the core, which is the part we need in order to activate the P organ. I personally think Geppetto was heading to retrieve the core himself so that he could return and implant it within us, giving him a greater degree of control over us before he woke us up. Sophia just happened to beat him to it. And us coming across Gemini was a nice bonus because then it meant that we could use him to collect the ergo we needed instead of relying on Geppetto to implant it within us. Anyway, let's go back to Gemini and the nameless puppet. It's worth considering the fact that it's called the nameless puppet in the first place. I think this is relevant for two big reasons. First, Gemini used to be inside of it, but now Gemini is in a new body. So the old body that was left behind can't really be referred to as Gemini anymore. It's now nameless. But more importantly, we also do not officially have a name in the game, right? We're nameless. Most people in the community affectionately refer to the player character as P, but he's never referred to as P or Pinocchio throughout the game, just Geppetto's puppet. And I think that's because we, along with the nameless puppet, are seen by Geppetto as nothing more than vessels to collect and store Ergo in an attempt to resurrect Carlo. There's no need to give us a name because he doesn't see us as anything more than a tool, a means to an end. And finally, as I just said, we are a puppet, right? Just like the original Gemini was. We gain humanity with the choices we make and develop a human consciousness, but our body is still just a machine. And at the end of the game, Geppetto says he needs our heart in order to revive Carlo. That's because Geppetto can't turn us, a pure puppet, into a living human being. The vessel would have to be made of human parts as well. And to me, it looks like the nameless puppet is made of a combination of puppet parts and human parts. We know from various sources that Geppetto used Carlo's Ergo within us. He even says it himself during the battle with the nameless puppet. But in order for Geppetto to collect Carlo's Ergo, he'd need to extract it from his body after he died from petrification, right? Well, I don't think he stopped there. After extracting Carlo's Ergo, it seems like he used parts from Carlo's actual body, parts that weren't damaged or affected by petrification, and grafted them onto Gemini's body as his first attempt at resurrecting Carlo. So, the nameless puppet is a physical hybrid of the original Gemini and Carlo. And how ironic that this story ends with the new incarnations of Gemini and Carlo battling against him, against themselves. Guys, thank you so much as always if you made it this far. Subscribe if you had fun. Let me know if you think my theories are absolutely crazy. I'm excited about this DLC. I hope you guys are too, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Okay, Big Duck out. Peace.